The first sound Emily Carter heard as she walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia, was a hurried, insistent beep, followed by a voice on the loudspeaker calling out a code she recognized without thinking. The same cadence of urgency she had already felt in makeshift tents in the desert and in the narrow corridors of forward operating bases, where the difference between a now and in a minute was the weight of a life. She pulled her new, stiff badge against the chest of her navy blue uniform and took a deep breath. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, stale coffee, and metal heated by machines. Outside, the damp cold of the coast made the city always seem like it was in a hurry to rain. She had rehearsed that moment in her head for months. Welcome to the team. Thank you for choosing St. Mary's. If you need anything, talk to the supervisor. Words that in practice were accompanied by evaluating glances and a kind of silence that Emily knew how to decipher. It was the silence of someone trying to guess if you can handle the pressure. The emergency room reception area was packed. People sat with thermal blankets, a man with his hand wrapped in makeshift gauze, a child asleep in its mother's lap. At the counter, an attendant typed incessantly. Emily walked past, following the signs to the changing room. Each step seemed too loud. She remembered the advice her mother had given her on the phone the night before, in a voice that mixed pride and fear. Do it your way, Em. You always have. In the locker room, she tied her brown hair into a tight bun, checked that the stethoscope was in the right pocket, and inadvertently touched the thin scar on her left wrist. A reminder of a splinter that hadn't been big enough to knock her out, but had been big enough to teach her, once again, that the body was vulnerable, and that the mind did what it could to hide it. Are you the new one? The voice came from behind, feminine and quick. Emily turned and saw a woman in her early 40s, with the posture of someone who commands without needing to shout. Her name tag read N. Harris, supervisor. Sue, Emily Carter. Great. You arrived early. I like that. Call me Harris. Harris assessed her with a look that seemed to read her file. Where are you from again? Your resume. I saw something about the military. Emily nodded. I served as a combat medic and then did nursing. I worked for a while in a community clinic. Now, here. Harris let out a short hum, neither approval nor doubt. This isn't the desert, but some days it feels like it. You'll be in the trauma room with Dr. Price's team today. He likes things his way. Do you understand what that means? I understand. Okay. Oh, and don't take it personally. Doctors are strange creatures. Some test, others are just how they are. Harris opened the door and gestured. Come on in. I'll introduce you. The trauma room was a world of its own, with bright white light and an organization that belied the waiting chaos. Monitors, emergency cart, packed instruments. Emily felt a strange comfort there, order as a promise. Harris went in first, and the conversation subsided. In the center, impeccably dressed in a lab coat and with an expression that suggested he was already tired before the day had even begun, stood Dr. Howard Price, head of the emergency room. Tall, with graying hair at the temples, his light eyes always seemed to be searching for mistakes. Near him, 2 residents and a male nurse were arranging a tray. Price, Harris said bluntly, this is Carter, our new trauma nurse. She starts today. Price slowly raised his eyes, the kind of look that doesn't bother to disguise the fact that it's sizing him up. Carter, doctor. Emily kept her voice firm and neutral. She had learned that any attempt to soften was interpreted as weakness. Experience, trauma, field care, triage. Field? What field? One of the residents, a young man with impeccable hair, smiled as if he were about to crack a joke. Afghanistan, mainly, Emily replied without flinching. The resident's smile faded slightly, but didn't disappear. Ah, so you're Nurse Rambo. The other resident chuckled softly. Price didn't laugh, but he didn't cut her off either. He just turned to Harris. Does she know the protocol here? We're not in a war zone. She knows enough, and she learns quickly, Harris replied. Her tone suggested the subject wasn't up for debate. Price looked at Emily again. Follow orders, don't improvise. Here, I'm the one who decides. Understood? Emily felt the phrase hit the table like a finger. She'd heard variations of it before, from officers and surgeons, from people who needed to assert themselves to avoid admitting fear. Understood, Doctor. Great! Price went back to what he was doing. We have a long morning ahead of us. Harris pulled Emily aside. Ignore it. Do your job. You'll see. When things get tough, the mask falls off. The morning progressed with small tests disguised as routine. A medication request repeated hurriedly, as if they wanted to see if she trembled. A comment about the newbie, loud enough for her to hear. Emily responded with action. She checked doses, checked for allergies, organized materials before they asked. Every time someone doubted her, she responded competently. Around midday, the pace quickened. An accident on the highway, 2 victims arriving, then an asthma attack, an elderly man in distress. Emily worked as if her body were clockwork. Her mind, however, registered every glance. It wasn't exactly hostile, it was a kind of comfortable disdain. The disdain of someone who thinks they've seen it all and that no one new has anything to teach. During a moment of respite, near the supply cabinet, she heard the resident's voice calling her Rambo. She thinks this is a mission. I bet she'll try to boss Price around. You're going to get a rude awakening. The other replied, and they both laughed. Emily picked up the gauze and said nothing. She had learned in places where noise meant danger that silence was sometimes the best weapon. And she had also learned that arrogance was fragile. It only took one event to shatter it. The event occurred in the late afternoon. The first sign was the different sound from the loudspeaker, a call that made the entire team change their posture. Level 1 trauma. Arrival in 5 minutes. Helicopter. Price appeared. In the hallway, as if summoned by an invisible thread. Room 1 ready. I want everything ready. Harris, call radiology and surgery. Let's go. Emily was already moving before they finished speaking. She opened the kits, checked the intubation, prepared a large bore IV line, and checked the defibrillator. The sound of the helicopter rotor approached like continuous thunder. Who is it? Asked one of the residents, adjusting his gloves. A paramedic rushed in, clipboard in hand. Army captain. Transfer from base, injury from explosion during training, unstable. Explosion in training, Price repeated, raising an eyebrow. Great, a weekend hero. Emily didn't react, but inside, something tightened. Not because of the captain, whom she didn't even know yet, but because of his tone. The same tone she'd heard from people who had never been where the word explosion didn't come in quotation marks. The rotor stopped suddenly, and a team rushed in pushing a stretcher. The body on the stretcher seemed too large for the space. A man in his early 30s, pale skin, half-closed eyes, breathing with difficulty. There was dirt and dried blood on his forehead. His uniform was torn, and an improvised bandage wrapped around his torso. A paramedic shouted the data. Captain Lucas Hayes, 34 years old, suspected hemothorax, multiple fractures, oxygen saturation of 82 with a mask, blood pressure dropping. In my office, Price commanded, and everyone lined up. Let's intubate. Double. A V-line, portable X-ray now. The stretcher was brought in. The captain groaned, his eyes opening for a moment. Emily saw something she recognized in them. It wasn't just pain. It was a struggle for control, the need to remain conscious, to not surrender her body to the unknown. Captain Hayes, you're at St. Mary's. We'll take care of you, said a nurse approaching. The man struggled, his hand searching for something in the air. No, no, hold him, a resident urged. Emily moved closer, observing the breathing. There was an asymmetrical effort in the chest, the skin pulling. She looked at the trachea. Slight deviation. The respiratory sound on one side seemed absent. Doctor, she said to Price calmly but firmly, I think he's developing a tension pneumothorax. His trachea. I'm seeing the patient, nurse, Price interrupted without looking at her. Do your job. Emily pursed her lips. It wasn't time to fight. It was time to save. She grabbed the decompression needle kit and placed it within reach. The captain tried to speak again, but his voice came out as a torn breath. "Don't sleep. Don't. Everything will be all right," said the resident, and prepared the sedative. Emily saw the panic in the captain's eyes widen. She recognized it with a clarity that made her taste the metallic flavor of memories. In the field, men trained not to trembled when they realized they were about to pass out. "Captain," Emily leaned close to his ear without touching it, just so he could hear her above the noise. "Look at me. You're safe. I need you to breathe with me. 1, 2. His eyes focused on her for a second. There was something there, a micro-expression, as if trying to capture a face. "Who is it?" The monitor beeped faster. The oxygen saturation dropped. Price lost his patience. "That's enough. Sedation now. Intubate." The resident began pushing the sedative. The captain struggled with a force that didn't match his low blood pressure. "No! No!" The moment the air stopped flowing and her chest stopped expanding on the right side, Emily didn't wait any longer. "Doctor, he's going into cardiac arrest," she said. "He needs decompression now." Price glared, annoyed. "You're not going to perform procedures here." "Then you do it," she replied, already holding the needle in her hand. A quick, heavy silence fell. The resident stopped, the syringe in mid-air. Price stared at Emily as if she had committed blasphemy, but the monitor didn't wait. The pressure plummeted. The sound of the heart turned into an alarm. Price cursed under his breath. "Needle!" Emily surrendered without triumph. Price hesitated just long enough to look like someone who hated to admit it, then inserted the needle into the second intercostal space. A forceful puff of air escaped, almost a whistle. The saturation rose a few points. The captain let out a sound that seemed like both relief and pain. "Okay," Price said harshly, as if he wanted to erase the moment. "Now, intubate." The procedure continued, but the tension remained. Emily carried on with precision, as if Price's gaze didn't weigh on her. When the tube was in place and the ventilator started, the room breathed a sigh of relief. The X-ray confirmed what Emily had suspected. His chest had fluid and air where it shouldn't, fractures and a risk of collapse. Surgery was called in. The captain was stabilized enough to go to the operating room. As they pushed the stretcher out, Price said, "For anyone who would listen, next time wait for orders. You're not a doctor." Emily stood beside the stretcher, watching the captain. He was sedated now, but his brows still looked tense, as if his body didn't know how to relax. She felt something old rise within her, the desire to ensure that someone wasn't reduced to a mere case, the desire to make the person be seen. The surgery lasted for hours. Emily stayed on extended duty, helping with the transfer, preparing blood, and relaying information. At some point during the night, the hospital quieted down, but it wasn't silent. The emergency room never truly slept. Around 2 in the morning, when she went to get more saline solution from the storeroom, she found 2 doctors talking in the hallway, unaware that she was there. "She almost made Price look slow," one of them said, laughing. "Almost?" The old man was furious. "She thinks she's all that. They're in the military, right? They think they know everything. In the end, we were the ones who performed the surgery." Emily grabbed what she needed and walked past them without speaking. Their laughter followed her like an inconvenient echo. She knew there was no point in arguing with people who only believed what made them comfortable. The next morning, Harris found her at the nurse's station, her eyes half closed, as if she too had spent the night awake. "You held up well. Price is in a bad mood. He's always there." Harris smiled slightly. "Yes, but there's a reason for it. Today, you saw the X-ray. If it weren't for that decompression, the captain would have... Well, you did the right thing. I didn't do it. He did. You put the decision right in his face." Harris looked around, lowering his voice. "They're going to test you until you're wrong, Em. Don't give them that satisfaction." Emily nodded. The word mistake had a different weight for her. In the field, a mistake was just another number on the report, a difficult call, a name on the scoreboard. She had no room for that kind of error. Captain Hayes was in the ICU. The report said stable, But Emily knew that stability in trauma was a fine line. She cared for other patients throughout the day, but every time she passed near the ICU, her gaze involuntarily went to the door. Late in the afternoon, Harris asked, "Are you going to take these medications to the ICU? They're short on supplies." Emily picked up the tray and walked down the hall to the unit. There, the air was colder, the sound more subdued, as if everyone were walking on eggshells to avoid shattering their chances of recovery. The ICU nurse, a woman named Lila, greeted Emily with a hurried wave. "Thank you. The captain, it was a night. He's waking up." "Waking up." Lila nodded, her eyes tired. "Yes, and it's difficult, very oriented, but agitated. He asked to be taken off the sedation as soon as possible. The ICU doctor, Dr. Stevens, said to keep it light. He wants to talk." Emily looked out the bedroom window. She saw the captain lying there, eyes open, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if searching for a way out. A tube was still helping him, but he was more conscious. There was a light, protocol-based restraint on his arm. "Does he have a history?" Emily asked. "I don't know. I only saw what's in the medical record. Missions, training, decorations, and a note about adverse reaction to sedation." Emily felt a shiver. "May I come in?" Lila hesitated. "You can, but be careful. He's strong, and he has a way of looking at you that makes you feel judged." Emily entered. The captain turned his head slowly. His eyes were brown, and even in his frailty there was a presence there, a kind of silent authority. "Captain Hayes," Emily said in a low voice. "I'm Emily, emergency room nurse. I was there yesterday." He stared at her for a long second. His fingers moved as if he wanted to point, but his hand trembled. "You." His voice came out weak, hoarse, but clear. "Try. You spoke to me. I spoke to you. You were having trouble breathing. We needed to act." He swallowed hard. "I remember. I thought that I was going to pass out and not come back." Emily moved a little closer, keeping a respectful distance. "You're back." His eyes gleamed with something that wasn't a tear, a suppressed moisture of someone who doesn't allow themselves to be. "You don't belong here." "I'm American, Captain." "But you mean from the hospital?" He nodded slowly. "You have the posture of a countryman. You spoke like someone who has seen people die." Emily felt her throat tighten. "I've seen it before." The captain closed his eyes for a moment, breathing carefully. When he opened them, he seemed more focused. "The doctors, are they good?" "Some are excellent, some are difficult, but they all want to save you." He let out a sound that almost resembled laughter. "Saving money and measuring ego at the same time. I know." He glanced at the restrained arm. "Take that off. I can't do it without an order. It's protocol to prevent you from getting hurt. I'm not going to rip anything out. I need to feel like I'm in control." Emily recognized the phrase as if it were her own from another time. "I can ask them to loosen it and stay here with you for a while, if you promise not to pull on the tubes." He looked at her, and in that look there was an agreement. "I promise." Emily went outside, spoke with Lila, and they returned to make adjustments. The captain didn't make any sudden movements. He just breathed, as if learning again. As Emily was leaving, he held her gaze and said in a whisper, "Thank you for yesterday. You gave me more time." Emily nodded, trying not to let her emotion show. "Rest. Your body needs it." In the hallway, as she was leaving, she encountered Dr. Price coming from the opposite direction, accompanied by 2 residents. They saw Emily leaving the ICU, and Price's gaze narrowed. "Carter," he said, with a smile that wasn't a smile. "So you've become a military private nurse now?" Emily stopped. "I came to deliver medication and check on him. It's my job. Your job is to follow the schedule. The ICU has its own team. They asked for help." The young resident chuckled softly. "She likes heroes." Price waved his hand dismissively, as if to dismiss the message. "If you're looking for a medal, look elsewhere. Here, we do medicine, not theater." Emily felt her blood boil. It wasn't anger directed at her. It was anger at seeing time and, again, people reduce suffering to mere performance. She took a deep breath and simply replied, "Excuse me, doctor," and she passed. That night, the captain experienced a temporary setback, a drop in oxygen saturation, a need to adjust the chest drain, more pain. Emily was in the emergency room and heard about it through the hallways. The news put the hospital on silent alert. Price was called back. The residents rushed in. Emily followed, not out of heroism, but out of instinct and a sense of responsibility. The ICU was full. Dr. Stevens was trying to coordinate. Price entered as if he owned the place. "What do we have?" "Drain blocked, likely residual bleeding," Stevens said. "I'll take care of it." Price went to bed. "Hayes, if you're listening, we'll adjust." The captain was awake, sweating, his hand reaching for his chest. His eyes were searching for something. "No, no, hold on," Price urged. The captain struggled, weaker than before, but the resistance was fierce. "Don't! Sleep! I need to." The monitor beeped. The team tried to hold and adjust it simultaneously. The drain wasn't draining. Emily, standing near the door, saw the captain's face grow paler. She saw the panic. She saw the same look of someone who feels trapped. "Captain," she called, loud enough to cut through the noise. "Lucas, look at me." His head snapped back as if the voice were an anchor. "You breathe with me. I'm here." Price stared at her, annoyed. "Carter, get out." Emily didn't. "Leave." Instead, she spoke to Stevens in a professional tone. "He reacts badly to loss of consciousness. If you're going to sedate him, explain each step and keep him oriented. This reduces the struggle." Stevens hesitated, but nodded. "Okay, Hayes, let's take it slow. You're going to feel some pressure. We're working on the drain." Price scoffed. "This is intensive care, not therapy." But the captain, looking at Emily, stopped struggling for a moment, as if her presence, the way she spoke, reminded his body that this was not an ambush. Calmly, they managed to unclog the drain. The dark liquid began to flow out. His oxygen saturation increased. The captain wept silently, without sound, like someone who didn't want to, but had no choice. Emily stayed until the end, helping with compresses, holding his hand when the trembling began. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. It was human. When everything stabilized, Stevens gave her a discreet sign of thanks. Price, on the other hand, left as if nothing had happened. The following morning, a meeting was scheduled. Hayes case debriefing, the internal email read. Emily knew, even before entering, that this wasn't just about clinical matters. It was about politics. In the meeting room, Price was at the head of the table. Stevens was beside him with papers. 2 residents and some nurses were seated. Harris was also there, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who had seen this kind of theatrics too many times. Price began with a cold presentation. Exams, procedures, decisions. When he got to the decompression on the first day, he spoke as if he were narrating an inevitable fatality. An emergency procedure was performed to reverse tension pneumothorax. A resident asked, "Who suggested it?" Price glanced sideways quickly and replied, "The team. The important thing is that it got done." Harris cleared his throat. It was Carter who raised the idea, and she left the kit ready. The silence grew heavy. Price fixed his eyes on Harris. "This isn't about individuals. It's about process." "The process includes listening to the team," Harris retorted. Price breathed as if controlling himself. "Nurses must fulfill their role, not challenge medical orders. That can cause chaos." Emily felt the eyes turn to her. She maintained her composure, but her hand tightened on the pen. "Chaos is ignoring clinical signs," Harris said. Price ignored it and continued. "As for last night's incident, it was patient agitation. The interference of side conversations doesn't help." Emily opened her mouth, but Harris lightly touched her arm, a silent warning. "Choose the moment." And then the door opened. At first, no one turned around. They were used to people arriving late. But the sound that followed brought the whole room to a standstill, the slow, firm sound of a cane hitting the floor. A man entered, accompanied by a hospital public relations officer and an ICU nurse. The man was pale, his arm in a sling, his chest still bandaged under an army t-shirt, but he was standing, Captain Lucas Hayes. Price stood up immediately, surprised and angry. "Captain, you shouldn't be out of the ICU." Hayes didn't answer immediately. He took 2 more steps, his face serious, his eyes scanning the people in the room. When his gaze met Emily's, something changed. It didn't soften, but it became precise, like a target finally identified. He took a deep breath, as if the act of standing was a decision. His left hand, the one, not in the sling, went to his side, seeking stability. The nurse beside him took a step, ready to catch him. Hayes raised his hand, stopping her. Then, with a visible effort, he straightened his spine. And there, in front of everyone, he raised his left hand in an impeccable military gesture and saluted Emily Carter. The silence in the room was absolute. Not a single pen scratching on paper, not a single whisper, only the faint sound of collective breathing. Emily froze for a second. The part of her trained in hierarchy wanted to respond automatically, but the human part, which wasn't prepared, froze. She just stood there, eyes fixed, heart pounding. "Nurse Carter," the captain said, his voice hoarse but firm, "thank you for saving my life." Price blinked as if he hadn't understood. "Captain, this is inappropriate." The medical team. Hayes turned to Price, and his gaze held an authority that didn't come from a lab coat, but from lived experience. "With all due respect, Doctor, I know when someone saves me. I know when someone sees me as a human being and not as a trophy or a nuisance." He took a breath, his chest aching, but he continued. "Yesterday, when my lung collapsed and I couldn't breathe, I saw the fear in the eyes of some people here, fear of making a mistake, fear of appearing weak, and I saw one person who wasn't afraid to state the obvious when the obvious could have kept me alive." The young resident swallowed hard. Hayes turned his gaze to Emily. "I was in explosives training, a miscalculation, 1 second. I felt the ground disappear beneath me, and in the midst of it all, I found myself again in a place that wasn't here. I was in Kandahar." The room became even quieter. "What I'm saying is, when you tried to sedate me, I wasn't fighting you. I was fighting the idea of blacking out and waking up somewhere I didn't recognize, with people I couldn't trust. I know that kind of fear. I've sent men to places where that becomes routine." He paused, and with effort pointed slightly at Emily. "And I know the voice of someone who's been there. I know the way someone knows that the right word at the right time can keep someone on this side. Carter spoke to me like a first responder speaks to someone in shock. She pulled me back. Twice." Price opened his mouth. "Captain, with all due respect, she's a nurse. Procedures and decisions are a prison," Hayes finished, and for the first time there was a harsher tone. "I know. I live in prison. But prison without respect turns into arrogance, and arrogance kills." He looked at everyone again. "I heard things, comments, laughter. I heard someone calling her Rambo. I heard people saying she was acting. I'll tell you one thing. If Carter was acting, then I wish all the theater in the world were as effective as her calmness when my chest felt like an empty drum." The resident lowered his eyes, red-faced. Emily felt a warmth rise in her face. It wasn't pride. It was a mixture of embarrassment at being exposed and a strange gratitude that someone had said aloud something she couldn't say without sounding defensive. Hayes breathed heavily, and the nurse beside him took a step. He allowed her to rest her elbow lightly on his chest. "I didn't come here to fight. I came because you're discussing the process as if I were a report. I'm the patient. I'm the life in the middle of this process. And I'm saying Carter made a difference, and she deserves respect." Harris, who had been quiet until then, let out a quick smile. Price tried to regain control. "Captain, we appreciate the feedback. Now please return to the ICU. Your blood pressure—" "I'll be back," Hayes said, then looked at Emily again. "Nurse Carter, you gave me something I thought I'd lost. The feeling that I wasn't alone when my body failed. I won't forget that." He lowered his hand, the greeting already given, and let the nurse lead him to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time, looking at Price. "And doctor, when you have a second, ask her where she learned to recognize a pneumothorax by looking at it. Maybe you'll learn something that no book teaches." The door slammed shut. The room felt as if someone had taken the air out of it. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Price cleared his throat, gathering papers, trying to compose himself. "Well, that was unexpected. It was necessary," Harris replied. Price looked at Emily, and his gaze, for the first time, wasn't one of superiority. It was one of discomfort, as if he'd been forced to see something he didn't want to. "Carter, your warning was pertinent. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't complete humility, but it was a crack." Emily didn't smile. She just nodded. "Thank you, doctor." The young resident shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't know." Emily looked at him. "You don't need to know. You need to respect." He nodded, swallowing. "Yes." The meeting ended without further accusations, but the hospital didn't change overnight. Changes were rarely so dramatic. They happened in small gestures. The next day, a doctor asked Emily's opinion on the best way to prepare an agitated patient without increasing panic. The following week, a resident stopped calling nurses by their last names without looking. 2 days later, Price, in the middle of a trauma room, asked, "Carter, what do you think?" as if the question had always been part of his vocabulary. Emily continued working. She continued being tested, but now the test was more clinical and less personal. She wasn't deluded. There were people who still thought she was full of herself. But there were also people who, after seeing the captain standing and saluting, began to look at her as someone who carried a history. Captain Hayes recovered slowly. He experienced pain, frustration, and bad nights. Sometimes, when Emily passed by the ICU, he was awake, staring at the ceiling. On one of those days, she entered with a glass of water and found a heavy silence in the room. "You're thinking about Kandahar again," she said without accusing. He turned his face slowly. "You can't read minds, Carter." "I don't need to. I recognize the look." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "You were there. I was there. As a paramedic. Then I became a nurse because I wanted to do it the right way, with structure, with continuity. I wanted life not to end with the first bandage." He let out a sigh that seemed to carry years. "You know what's worse? It's not the pain in my chest. It's the feeling that when I close my eyes, I'll go back to the sand." Emily sat in the chair, close by, but didn't intrude. "You come back a little, and then you come back here, one day at a time. You talk as if it were easy. No, it isn't, but it's possible." Hayes looked at his own hand. "That day in training, I was trying to prove something. To myself, to someone I don't even know. And in the end, I almost became a statistic." Emily gave a short smile. "It happens. Egos explode too." He chuckled softly, and for the first time, the laughter seemed truly human. "You dare say that to a captain? I have the courage to say this to anyone who is alive and needs to hear it." He became serious again. "You know those people. Price, they weren't just testing you, they were belittling you. That pissed me off. Have people ever belittled you, Captain?" Yes." He clenched his jaw, uncomfortable. "In the beginning, when I was just a guy from rural Texas trying to manage people who thought they knew everything, I learned to yell, to assert myself. I thought it was the only way. Then I realized that yelling doesn't replace respect." Emily nodded. "I can't yell. If I yell, I become a stereotype, the problematic nurse. So I do what I know how to do. I save lives, and I let the facts speak for themselves." Hayes stared at her for a moment, his gaze filled with quiet gratitude. "The facts spoke for themselves yesterday." She stood up. "Rest, and if you feel like you're going to pass out and not come back, call. I'll come." He nodded, and his gaze followed Emily to the door. In the following months, Emily became part of the hospital as if she had always been there. But the process of belonging wasn't passive. She built respect with details, remembering the name of a patient that no one else remembered, noticing the trembling of a hand that indicated a shock before the monitor registered. It holding a shoulder and saying, "You're here," to someone who was far away. One day, early in the summer, St. Mary's received a group of nursing students for an internship. Emily was assigned as a mentor to one of them, a young woman named Kayla, with large eyes and nervous hands. "On the first day I thought I was going to throw up," Kayla confessed, holding a medical chart as if it were a shield. "The doctors, some of them look at us like we're nothing." Emily looked at Kayla and saw herself in the mirror from weeks ago. "You are nothing. You are the difference between panic and calm, between wrong and right, and sometimes between life and death. But nobody applauds you for it. And how do you put up with it?" Emily breathed. "You remember why you came, and you learn not to ask permission to be competent." Kayla smiled, trembling. "You seem so confident." Emily almost laughed. "I'm not. I just learned to function with fear. It's different." That same day, a mass casualty. Emergency occurred. A building fire, people with burns, smoke inhalation. The trauma room turned into an anthill. Kayla froze when she saw a woman screaming, her skin reddened, her hair singed. Emily held Kayla's arm. "Look at me. Breathe with me. 1, 2. Kayla obeyed and her eyes returned. She began to work. Across the room, Price watched. Emily saw his gaze above the mask. It was no longer contempt. It was recognition, and perhaps a kind of silent respect he would never admit in words. A few weeks later, Captain Hayes was discharged. The hospital arranged a discreet procedure. No cameras, no speeches. Emily was in the hallway when she saw Hayes, now walking without his cane, a little thinner, but with a more flushed face. He was wearing a simple uniform and a coat over it. "You're leaving," Emily said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I will, against my wishes. I don't want to be cared for by you and annoyed doctors," he replied, and the corner of his mouth turned up. Emily laughed briefly. "Don't give them any ideas." Hayes stopped in front of her. "I did something." He did. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket. "I wrote to the hospital administration. Nothing heroic about it. Just a report from a patient saying what you did and formally requesting that you be recognized. You deserve it." Emily opened her mouth to deny it, but he raised his hand. "Don't argue. You may not like medals, but I know the power of an official record. The books they respect also need to have your name on them." Emily felt her throat tighten. "I didn't do this." "I know," Hayes breathed, "and that's why I did it." She held the envelope as if it were too light to contain any meaning. "Thank you." He nodded. "I'm going to start therapy too. A captain who can't talk about his own fear isn't good for anyone. I understood that when I saw you, talking to me in the middle of the chaos without belittling me." Emily smiled, a smile that showed more weariness than joy, but it was genuine. "Good. This will be the most difficult mission." "I suspected as much." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "May I?" Emily squeezed his hand. His hand was warm, firm, but not crushing. It was the kind of squeeze from someone who has learned not to dominate, but to acknowledge. "I owe you a life," Hayes said. "You owe me nothing. You will live. That's the payment." He let go of her hand and took a step back. Then, lightly, without excessive formality, he made a small greeting with 2 fingers on his forehead, almost a joke, almost a bow. "Nurse Carter." Emily stifled a laugh and responded with a nod. That was all. As he walked away down the corridor, Emily stood watching for a moment, feeling the hospital return to its rhythm. A patient calling, a distant alarm, hurried footsteps, and strange as it seemed, she felt that something had changed inside her. It wasn't that she needed validation. She knew what she was capable of. But for years, she had carried the feeling that what she had experienced in the countryside was a language that didn't fit into civilian life. There, in that hospital, she had found a place where that language could become care and not just a memory. At the end of that shift, Harris called her into his office. "Close the door," Harris said. Emily closed the door, suspicious. "Did something happen?" Harris picked up a piece of paper from the table. Your name has been put forward for an advanced certification and a retention bonus. And Captain Hayes sent a letter. Official, well written. Command read it. Harris smiled. Congratulations. You annoyed enough people to get noticed. Emily sighed, half laughing, half disbelieving. I was just doing my job. And that's what scares the vain people, Harris said, because their work is good. Emily left the office and went to the parking lot. The sun was low, orange over the buildings. She got into her car and sat there for a minute with her hands on the steering wheel, not starting. The engine. Her body finally felt the weight of the day, and for a moment she let her mind drift back to the past. The dust, the noise, the screams. She saw faces. She heard names. Then, as she had told the captain, she returned. She returned to that parking lot, to that smell of hot asphalt, to the feeling that despite everything she was there, alive, working, making sense of things. The next day, she returned to the hospital, and there was a new sign on the wall near the trauma room. Teamwork saves lives. Listen, respect, act. It was simple, almost generic, but Emily knew where it had come from. Harris walked past her and winked. Price appeared minutes later holding a coffee. He paused for a moment in front of the sign, read it, and then looked at Emily. Carter, he said. Doctor, he hesitated. His pride seemed to tie his tongue. Before, I was harsh. Emily waited, expressionless, neither demanding nor making things easy. Price let out a sigh. I don't like being caught off guard. Almost nobody likes it, Emily replied. He nodded as if that phrase were a concession he could accept. I want you to stay in the fixed trauma room. We need people who can see. Emily simply nodded. Okay. Price turned to leave, then stopped again. And Carter. Good job. When he left, Emily noticed Kayla, the intern, standing beside him, her eyes wide. Did he compliment you? Kayla whispered, as if it were a legend. Emily smiled. You never get used to it. But you learn one thing. When someone belittles you, it's not you who becomes smaller. It's their perception. Kayla nodded, as if keeping a password. The loudspeaker summoned another trauma. The team rushed in. Emily entered the room, hands steady, mind clear. And for a second, before the chaos began, she thought of the captain standing, wounded but upright, saluting. It wasn't the salute itself. It was the gesture of acknowledging a person behind the uniform, behind the lab coat, behind the badge. She positioned herself beside the arriving stretcher, seeing the fear in their eyes. Looking at the patient's face, he heard his breathing faltering and said, in the same voice he had used before, Look at me. You are safe. Breathe with me. And, in some quiet way, the entire hospital seemed to learn to breathe together too.